A missing child, a bomb disguised as a Christmas gift, a civil rights-era Klan murderer brought to justice. Join David Ridgen as he and victims' family members track down leads, speak to suspects, and search for answers in the CBC's hit cold case podcast, Someone Knows Something. Subscribe to SKS wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Danse, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. From rising water levels to shrinking cedar canopy, this week we're partnering with UBC journalism students to hear how climate change is affecting Indigenous communities in British Columbia.
Climate change is something that is new. We can't predict what that is really going to mean.
I could hear the saws going, chainsaws, and about every 30 minutes one of the big cedars would come down. We'll never see those again in our lifetime. 30 minutes to take it down and 1,000 years to grow it.
Plus, how the COVID-19 pandemic is changing conversations around climate change. Every year, journalism students in UBC's Reporting in Indigenous Communities course, founded by CBC's Duncan McHugh, pick a theme they'd like to cover and work with Indigenous communities to tell their stories. This year, the students chose to explore the theme of climate change and its impact on communities in British Columbia. Our first story takes us about an hour's drive outside Vancouver. McMillan Island sits right in the middle of the Fraser River on the reserves of Kwanlin First Nation. As the snow melts every spring there, water levels rise, and the community worries that a changing climate could mean more floods. UBC students Pratyush Dayal and Joshua Azizi bring us that story.
It's like a river that comes flowing all the way down this way. It's got one-track mind.
Carol Gabriel lives here on McMillan Island on Kwantlen First Nation land. Today, she stands outside the band office. She's remembering the last big flood here, back in 2012, when the water was so high, fish were swimming by.
I've actually worked here, and it was flooding really bad, and I seen a sturgeon swimming that way, and I go, oh my God, there's a big sturgeon just swimming, past the building here. So
about 100 people live here on McMillan Island, and it is right here on the Fraser River in the middle of the floodplain. With every flood comes challenges, like cleaning up the island when the water brings in septic waste.
It's terrible. We all have to get in our hazmats and get our gloves on and start cleaning and scrubbing everything. So it's quite the cleanup anyways, and everybody has to pitch in.
These days, people are pitching in to better prepare for a flood. A major flood along the river could devastate this island, and climate change could mean more water, more flooding, and more challenges for its residents. Elaine Kenny is concerned about what could happen.
Climate change is something that is new. We can't predict what that is really going to mean. We do know that climate change is going to increase precipitation. It could increase snowpacks, depending on how those snowpacks melt.
Elaine is the project manager for the Kwantlen First Nation. She knows they can't stop the Fraser River from flooding, but they can be prepared.
So our biggest priority is creating an emergency response plan that will assist with evacuation when's necessary and all the protocols that we would need. The second is in regards to buildings. So we have increased our minimum building elevation from 6.2 meters to 7.0 meters.
Carol watches the water levels closely, especially during spring flooding season called freshet. She lives in a house that she built with her husband back in 1993.
Behind my place, if there's a big pond, and then it's freshet, well, if those two things rise together, and then it comes towards my house, and that's when I'm going to start worrying. But if I don't see any water back there, we still have a chances that it might not flood. But those are my checkpoints here and there. And of course the Salmon River. I don't know how you came out here, but off of Glover Road there's a farm field and there's a golf course. And if those two fields have to totally flood, then that's when I really know that it's going to flood.
Harley Chappell is the chief of the Semiahmoo First Nation, and he too knows the challenges of living near the water. He works with other First Nations on flood response strategy and worries about climate change.
Are we feeling the impacts of this right now? Definitely. You know, we in Semiahmoo along the coast, we're starting to see higher tides. We're starting to see worse storms. We're starting to see tidal inundation and then the sea level rise.
All consequences of climate change. Harley says Stalo lives have always revolved around the water, but the Canadian government placed their reserves on the floodplains.
Historically, we didn't all live right on the river's edge because we knew that these flooded regularly. So we lived up in different areas. And then when contact happened and when accessibility became an issue, a lot of the communities were put on reserves on the edges of the Fraser River for accessibility to outside agencies. And you know, I look at some of the communities. I look at Kwantlen, that's on McMillan Island, and I look at Barnston Island, that's Catesy, and those communities are at risk every year. Every year they're at risk.
All these risks and impacts of climate change spur fear.
The fear of communities losing homes, the fear of communities losing life, the fear of, you know, our river becoming so decimated, destroyed that salmon habitat isn't there anymore. That's the livelihood. That's the livelihood of the Stala people. That's the livelihood of Coast Salish people, were those salmon. So is there a fear? Yes, definitely.
Back on McMillan Island, Carol is well aware of the risks. She is determined to stay.
It's hard for anyone to leave a place that they know in so long. Like in me, thought I was going to leave a few times. I did leave and come back. There's no place like this anywhere, you know, where I can have a nice big yard, you know, where I could put a pool. Nobody wants to leave. This is their home.
For Unreserved, I'm Joshua Azizi on the Kwantlen First Nation.
Thanks to UBC students Joshua Azizi and Pratyush Dayal for bringing us that story. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Still to come.
This is where the cedar grew. The stumps in the background, these massive stumps, are cedar stumps. But the trees they're planting here are Douglas fir. These sites are getting too dry for cedar. And that means we're not getting any cedar regenerating here.
How climate change is threatening old-growth forests. But first, the signs of climate change are everywhere. Lighter snowpacks, hotter temperatures, rising water levels, and the conversations around climate are shifting. Just 2 years ago, the phrase Green New Deal was just a bullet point in a political platform. Since then, it's expanded into a worldwide phenomenon, and a solution some feel will slow down the human-caused portion of climate change. Julian Brave Noisecat has been there every step of the way. He worked with elected officials to help draft the Green New Deal resolution. Julian is a member of the Canham Lake Band, Tukeskin in British Columbia. Hi, Julian. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first of all, what is the Green New Deal?
So the Green New Deal began as a resolution introduced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York and Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts. It's a resolution with big ambitions to take on the dual crises of inequality and climate change. But the discourse here, because, America's media market and political scene often spills over into Canada and Europe and elsewhere, has also been picked up by sort of more left-leaning forces in other countries. So the New Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Party in Canada, picked up the Green New Deal as part of their platform and has been talking about it in the Canadian context as well. And youth climate activists who are also sort of affiliated with the left wing in Canada have also been talking about potentially a Green New Deal for Canada. What the Green New Deal is big jobs, infrastructure, investment sort of package. So your listeners might be familiar with the sort of carbon price and tax approach that has been led by the Liberal government in Canada. And the distinction between that approach and the Green New Deal is that rather than sort of forcing consumers and businesses to have a trade-off where they, have to pay higher prices for gasoline and things like that to sort of benefit the environment and to lower emissions, the Green New Deal says that we should invest in decarbonizing a whole set of industries and sectors in a way that will create jobs and promote a more fair and equitable economy.
Why is this important for Indigenous people in Canada?
So I think that First Nations and Indigenous people in both the United States and Canada have played an outsized role in the fight for environmental justice over the last 10, 20 years, maybe even further back if you look at the history of resistance to pipelines and forestry and mining. First Nations have often been some of the loudest voices, putting their very bodies on the line in front of pipelines and projects that are going to damage the environment and public health. So, firstly, I would say that a lot of the grassroots energy of the Green New Deal comes from First Nations. For example, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the politician who led the charge for a Green New Deal here in the United States, actually got started as a volunteer organizer supporting the movement at Standing Rock. So I would say that the Indigenous movement, both in the United States and Canada, really has played a significant underlying role that people haven't fully appreciated in producing the Green New Deal. I think the questions that First Nations sovereignty and rights raise for the Green New Deal are not just the fact that communities are disproportionately harmed and polluted by the fossil fuel industry in particular and other extractive industries more generally, but also, what it might look like to, in both the federal systems of Canada and the United States, to incorporate First Nations governments as equal partners in the federal system that is pushing for, action on climate change. What would it look like for First Nations governments in Canada and the United States to lead a transition to clean energy, to create a lot of the jobs in their communities, to be empowered as environmental stewards and protectors? And I think the examples that we should be looking to are things like the Guardian Watchman program in the Great Bear Rainforest and other parts of Canada, where First Nations 20, 30 years ago stood up against logging and forestry, and now today employ some of their own members, as environmental stewards and protectors, making sure that some of the most important carbon sinks in North America remain protected and can help us in the fight against climate change. So I think it's those kinds of things that we should be thinking about. And then in a broader sort of intellectual and philosophical sense, I think that climate change really is an existential threat for humans and human societies around the world. And of course, First Nations, know what it means to live through an apocalypse. We lived through the apocalypse of colonization. We lived through the apocalypse of our children being taken away to residential schools in Canada and boarding schools in the United States. And in a broader sense of, humans sort of confronting this enormous tragic upheaval to our societies, I think that Indigenous people in Canada and more generally actually have perspectives and experiences to lend to those set of issues.
There's been a lot of discussion about a Green New Deal in the U.S., but only a little bit here in Canada, including dismissal from Alberta's premier. What have you noticed around the discourse of a Green New Deal in Canada?
Yeah, so I think that for many people, climate change feels like a big and distant phenomenon, and honestly, it felt that way to me. until just a few years ago. And if your listeners remember, just a few years ago, basically the entire province of British Columbia was on fire in the summer. And actually my uncles, who fight wildfires pretty much every year, were tasked with defending our reserve, our community, amidst those wildfires. And people were evacuated and had to drive all over the province to basically flee this inferno. And that was really the first time that I felt, the impacts of climate change were impacting my life and people who I loved in a very tangible way. I imagined amidst those wildfires, my grandmother's house, burning down, and what that would mean and the pain that would, inflict upon our family. More recently, this spring, I'm not exactly sure why, but there was pretty bad flooding on our reserve that almost actually, the water line almost came up to some of the houses on, we call it the main reserve. It's kind of the older part of the reserve where the church is and stuff like that. And just, watching that happen and imagining, already a lot of those homes have a dozen or more people living in them. If those homes were inundated, where would those people go? What would happen to our community if we were touched by a climate change induced natural disaster like that in a very, personal and damaging way? And I think that, there are many communities that are starting to feel those impacts and starting to connect them to climate change. And if not, there's obviously going to be many more communities in the coming years that will feel those kinds of impacts, whether it's through wildfires or floods or, droughts impacting crops or any of those issues. And, I think that if we do this right, that concern can be leveraged for a response that is, well considered and protects all sorts of people, regardless of their class or race or income or anything like that. But if we don't get ahead of this and, suddenly there's sort of a big natural disaster that, impacts the economy in a really big way, it's not impossible to imagine a world where, the wealthy and the rich basically retreat into their own sort of protected enclaves and leave the rest of us out to dry, not unlike what happened in Puerto Rico in the United States a few years ago, or what happened in Hurricane Katrina, where, it was really black and brown communities and people who lost their homes and lost a lot of their wealth and lost their jobs and had to leave the places they'd lived for generations. So I think that, again, like these impacts are starting to touch, people's lives in very intimate ways. I definitely feel that way. I definitely live with ongoing concern that one of these days a wildfire is going to uproot my family and loved ones, in the place that we've lived in since forever. And, I think that to me underscores the imperative to take action as soon as possible and in a way that includes everyone and is not just a way to protect, those who already have wealth and power.
Mm-hmm. Some discussion around the Green New Deal is that it needs to center not just on First Nation, Indigenous people, but people of color in general. Why do you think that is?
So one of the great injustices of climate change is that the people who often contributed the least to pollution, emissions, and global warming, communities of color who do not have kind of money to spend on luxuries like flights across the country and, sort of high carbon lifestyles and vacations and all that kind of stuff, often live in the most polluted parts of society, live adjacent to polluting industries, live without clean water, without clean air. And of course, in a global sense, this is also true because many of the countries that contributed a minuscule amount to emissions, places like the Marshall Islands or the Maldives, are literally going to be flooded by rising seas that are caused by climate change. So again, people who contributed the least to this problem are often the ones who are going to be harmed the most by it.
Now, since this pandemic, many of these actions, many of these pushbacks have sort of been stalled, but the work really hasn't. So how do you think the pandemic has affected the conversation or the movement around the Green New Deal?
So speaking from the American context, I live in Washington, D.C., and after the pandemic, Congress here has actually passed some laws, which is a very rare occurrence in the United States, where we have a very obstinate political process. So notably absent from any of those stimulus laws that were passed were any proposals that would put funding into clean energy, promote jobs and protect jobs in those industries, or, put any regulations in place to address climate change and pollution. And this is, of course, because the Republican Party in the United States controls the Senate and the White House, and President Trump has himself described climate change as a quote-unquote hoax invented by the Chinese. So we have yet to see any actual movement on climate change legislation here in the United States amidst the pandemic. But encouragingly, I work for a think tank called Data for Progress, and our sort of core thing is that we do these surveys that measure public opinion. And encouragingly, we've seen a 10-point jump in support for things like green jobs and the Green New Deal amidst this pandemic. So while politicians, are not legislating on climate change, we've spent trillions of dollars, and pretty much zero of those dollars have gone towards fighting climate change, which is a real missed opportunity.
Do you see anything like a Green New Deal on the horizon for the U.S. or for Canada?
I'm hoping that we will have the opportunity to legislate something that either is called the Green New Deal or bears the fingerprints and DNA of the Green New Deal. Of course, I'm also looking across the Atlantic and across the border in Canada because, again, from a good governance perspective, and of course Canada has good governance in its own sort of country's motto, it's really irresponsible for any sort of enlightened governing party to spend this much money on the economy and have not only none of it go to, the industries of the future, industries that are going to help us fight climate change, but also have some of that money actually bail out many of the polluting industries that science and I would say morality tell us, need to sunset sooner rather than later.
Julian, thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Julian Brave Noisecat is a member of the Cannon Lake Band Chekeskin in British Columbia and is now based in Washington, D.C. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Talking all about the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities on the show today. Still ahead, how rising water temperatures can have a profound effect on salmon.
A number of years ago, it might have been 2014 or 2015, when we were harvesting fish and their skin could literally just rub off. The water was so warm that you could grab a salmon and it was just mush. That cold water is vital. And I understand 2-degree temperature difference can make the difference.
More on that in just a few minutes. But first, the Reporting in Indigenous Communities course allows students to pick a topic and work with Indigenous communities to tell their stories. This year, they dug into stories about climate change and how it's affecting communities on the West Coast. Cedar trees are known as the tree of life in coastal Indigenous communities across British Columbia. Cedar trees need forest canopies to thrive. But as the climate warms, the few remaining old-growth forests are under stress. Aisha Ghaffar and Serena Renner bring us that story.
Max Chakite looks around his carving shed. Everything is wood. Shelves, tables, painted masks, even a canoe. The floor is soft with shavings. The scent, unmistakable. Fresh-cut cedar.
I'm putting in my love, my passion of my culture and who I am, and symbolizes who I am.
Max is a master carver from Lequiltok First Nation. He's sliding a curved blade across a yellow cedar pole.
I got an eagle on it. It represents power of the sky. Bear, power of the land. And they both live off the salmon.
Yellow cedar is rare for Max. He's used to working with western red cedar.
The red cedar is much easier to work with and much lighter, right? So I rather work with red myself.
Western red cedar is known as the tree of life in coastal First Nations. It provides wood for canoes and homes, material for hats, masks, and of course poles. But from the lower mainland to northeast Vancouver Island, the tree of life is dying. It's suffering from summer drought, predicted to get worse with climate change.
I think I don't know if there's, for the next couple of generations, I don't know if they'll be there. How does that make me feel? Angry and mad. You know, like logging industry can just take what they want. And they say it's available for us, but it's hard to get sometimes.
Gina Thomas scans a logging cut block near the Adam and Eve Rivers, northeast Vancouver Island. She runs the Guardian Watchman program for Clowetsee's First Nation. All around her is a wasteland of wood chips, branches, and giant tree stumps.
This is a floodplain along the river, and this is where the cedar grew. The stumps in the background, these massive stumps, are cedar stumps. But the trees they're planting here are Douglas fir. These sites are getting too dry for cedar, and that means we're not getting any cedar regenerating here. So it's also a very big concern.
That's one of many concerns. 80% of the island's old-growth forest has already been logged. Young cedars need older trees to protect them. A warmer climate with less forest canopy could be disastrous for cedar. Gina worries if the trees die, her culture will suffer.
It's a spiritual thing to us. I can't stress that enough. A lot of our potlatch system was around cedar. You know, we built our homes. We wore cedar as protection from supernatural beings. It just was everything to us.
Gina's daughter Alex has done cedar research for Namaqualis Council, which represents 5 First Nations. Council members are writing new logging policies to protect cedar for future generations. Gina remembers her own days of research for Western Forest products nearby. Every 30 minutes, she heard chainsaws.
So I could hear the saws going, chainsaws, and about every 30 minutes, one of the big cedars would come down. And you could hear almost the feel of the ground vibrate. They're this monster trees, and it took them 30 minutes to cut it with a saw. So we'll never see those again in our lifetime. 30 minutes to take it down and 1,000 years to grow it. So it's very frustrating. and I don't know, heartfelt. I don't know. It's like losing children. I don't know how else to say it, but.
Randy Frank walks the Comox waterfront, south of Campbell River. He's a Comox Guardian Watchman and a master carver. He points out the local landmarks he can see from the shoreline.
This is the town of Courtney, and there's our glacier, of course, but you can see there's one there where all the snow patches are down below. Those are all cut blocks. The cut blocks vary from, a very small patch to kilometers long. So it's just basically total devastation, right, for the animals and everything that lives inside of that. But they keep logging, so. And with the environment changing, the weather changing, it's just not looking good, really.
One of Randy's jobs as a Guardian Watchman is to monitor cedar health in the face of climate change.
Well, my biggest issue is it's getting too warm. And when we do get the rains, it rains too much, so it floods. So the cedar trees are going from one extreme to the next, and we're finding a lot of the trees, cedar trees on the open spaces are drying up and dying. With the hot summers here, the cedar trees it's almost like the branches are burning. So it's tough to watch.
Watching the trees suffer is personal for Randy. He even named his second son Cedar.
When he was born, he was just so cute and he had blonde hair. So the first thing that popped into my head was, oh my gosh, cedar tree. And it kind of stuck. And his mom looked at me and went, perfect. So
Cedar is now 18. He works with his dad as a Guardian Watchman. It's like Alex, following in the footsteps of her mom, Gina. It's the children who give Randy hope for the future of cedar trees.
To watch him growing up in this environment, he has so much respect for the land, for the animals. It's neat to see because It's almost like they're reverting back to how it used to be. They want to keep everything the way it is or better than what it is right now. And taking the role of being that guardian, I guess you could say, of the land.
I'm Serena Renner in Comox, British Columbia.
Thanks to UBC journalism students Serena Renner and Aisha Ghaffar for bringing us that story. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. This week, we're listening to stories produced by students in UBC's Reporting in Indigenous Communities course on the topic of climate change. For 4 years, the Sustainability Management Team, AELSTO, has worked to rebuild a salmon habitat around the Chiam First Nation. Carrie Lynn Victor and a small team of volunteers work together to save Fraser River salmon. But with climate change, water temperatures are rising, and all of their efforts may not be enough. Alejandrina Alvarez and Riley Teisvold have that story.
My English name is Carrie Lynn Victor, and the ancestral name I carry is Homuntalat. I'm from the community of Chiam, and I'm an artist and also manager of an environmental consultancy locally. The band, the community, applied for the money to do the work, restoration work, and over the course of 3 years, removed invasive vegetation, primarily Himalayan blackberry. So what happens is rocks and sand and debris from upstream end up staying here, and this bar grows taller. And our intention is to find points in the bar where we can create habitat and also remove the gravel, because we know there's chum spawning down below, and we know there's coho down below. Salmon ultimately need a very specific quality of gravel. They need ideal temperature and depth. They need cover above the water and the riparians so that they're protected. And we've seen what happens to the salmon when the water gets too warm. A number of years ago, it might have been 2014 or 2015, when we were harvesting fish, and their skin could literally just rub off. The water was so warm that you could grab a salmon and it was just mush. That cold water is vital, and I understand 2-degree temperature difference can make the difference. So one of the things that we're doing here with reintroducing riparian plants is trying to shade the water that is available. When salmon are spawning and they don't have those ideal conditions, they either go somewhere else or we see the end of them. It's hard to express in words how difficult it is to witness and to feel so powerless in the declining salmon situation. I think the one population that really hit us the hardest was the early spring Chinook disappearance. Like this time of year, March, leading into April and May, we would harvest our first spring salmon of the year, and those ones are the oiliest, the richest. There's this sense of joy that hits you in the spirit from eating the early spring that come up the river, and they're absent. You know, when I was a kid and even teenager and in my early 20s, we were having our first salmon ceremony in March. Though the quality of those early springs and the contribution that they make to our health, in the absence of those nutrients is noticed. We notice. I can't feed that to my son. He doesn't know what it's like to get excited about the first springs of the year, and it's heartbreaking. I find there's that overwhelming sense of impacted landscape follows me throughout my day. And the artwork is a way of looking at the world through a lens of story. And sometimes those stories are natural, biological stories, and sometimes those stories are those sohuyam, and sometimes those stories are just personal experiences and being outside. I think of the challenging aspects of this work, and one of the challenging aspects to it was getting community support. I know sometimes from external perspective, it might look like a First Nation has a unified perspective on anything. I'd just like people to know that inside a community, there's many views and perspectives, just like any other community. And even though fish are valued, they're valued in different ways. But in the long run, we're hoping to see salmon come back. And those are the sacrifices that we're making. We're making those recreational use sacrifices in order to restore salmon population. So one outweighs the other, in my opinion. Yeah. I think every little bit helps. If we can restore aspects of habitat to nurture, one generation, and then we see consecutive generations returning, then that's a whole population of salmon and the experiences environmentally and to people and to wildlife that kind of ripple out from those salmon populations surviving.
Thanks to Alejandrina Alvarez and Riley Teisvold from UBC's Reporting in Indigenous Communities course. That course pairs journalism students with Indigenous communities to share their stories. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. If you want to learn more or share any of the stories you heard on the show today, you can find them on our website at cbc.ca/unreserved, or find us on Facebook and Twitter. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. Special thanks this week to Catherine Gretzinger, Chantel Belrichard, and the students at UBC for sharing their work with us. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Agosay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.